This video is sponsored by Aura. More on them a little later. In early 2018, a courtroom in Brown County, Wisconsin was absolutely packed with people. They were there for what had become one of the strangest and most highly publicized trials in the state's recent history. Nearly 2 years earlier, this area had been the setting of a horrible crime. And normally, by this stage in the process, you would expect that the case would be pretty straightforward. Obviously, you can never truly know what a verdict is going to be, but I mean from the public perspective. Usually with high-profile cases like this, you're past the point where there are major twists or surprises. However, that's what was weird about this case. While there was only technically one person on trial, the actual proceedings ended up revolving around two suspects, each of whom had different stories and different seemingly incriminating evidence against them. Understandably, this was a huge hurdle for the prosecution, or at least that's the way that it appeared. You see, what those watching didn't know was that prosecutors had a secret witness. This witness was not a person. In fact, it wasn't a living thing at all. Still, the testimony it provided was about to definitively prove which one of these two stories was true once and for all. As always, my name is Nigel, I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. On May 20th, 2016, 31-year-old Nicole Vanderheyden was looking forward to a much-needed night out. Nicole, who everyone referred to as Nikki, was planning to spend the evening with her boyfriend, Doug Detrie, and several of his friends. It was gearing up to be a classic Friday night on the town. The group of them had tickets to see a show at a popular sports bar and concert venue in Green Bay, Wisconsin called The Watering Hole. And after that, they were going to stop by a couple of other local drinking spots. The reason Nikki was so excited was that this was her first night out in a while. The last year and a half had been a bit of a whirlwind for her, and there had been a lot of changes. Her and Doug's relationship was still pretty new. But on top of this, the two of them were also new parents. Now, motherhood itself was not new to Nikki. She had two other children from a previous relationship, a daughter named Michaela and a son named Tyler. Nikki had actually been married before to a man named Brian. The relationship hadn't been a bad one by any means, but they had gotten married very quickly after Nikki finished high school in 2003. They'd eventually ended up growing apart and realizing that they just wanted different things out of life. For the last several years, Nikki had been busy focused mainly on her son and daughter, but also her career. She ended up going back to school and attending the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. She graduated in 2010 with a double major in science and education. And after that, she became a substitute teacher with the Green Bay area public school system, primarily teaching science to elementary and middle school students. It was a job that Nikki absolutely adored, and it allowed her to fuse two of her biggest passions in life: her love of caring for and educating children, and her interest in science and discovery, particularly as it related to the natural world. Nikki was a huge fan of anything to do with nature, the outdoors, and staying active. She loved going on hikes, taking her kids to the zoo, and was also just generally pretty into health and fitness. All of this is to say that things had been going well for Nikki, and she was perfectly happy being a single mom. She had her kids, her family, and a large circle of friends, and she was living a very full life. But as is so often the case in life, just when you feel like you're comfortable, that's when everything changes. And this is certainly what had happened in this case. In January of 2015, Nikki met Doug Detrie while they happened to be at the same bar. The two of them got to talking, quickly hit it off, and started seeing each other. Doug came from a wealthy family that owned a successful home building company. He was really drawn to Nikki's sense of adventure, and he liked the way that she was spontaneous and fun. He also liked the way that she was thoughtful and seemed to genuinely care about his well-being. As I mentioned, Nikki was into exercise and staying in shape, and she encouraged Doug to take part in these activities with her. To help motivate him, one of the gifts she bought him was a Fitbit so that he could keep track of his progress. As I hinted at before, the romance moved fast. Within just a few weeks, Nikki discovered she was pregnant. She and Doug decided to raise the baby together, and shortly thereafter, Nikki, Michaela, and Tyler all moved into Doug's house in Ledgeview, a town just outside of Green Bay. So yeah, you see what I meant when I said things had been a whirlwind. Nikki and Doug had really jumped into the relationship with both feet. But despite this being something that neither of them had planned for, it seemed to most people like they were happy. And in October of 2015, they officially welcomed their new son Dylan into the world. That brings us back to the night of May 20th, 2016. As you might imagine, Doug and Nikki's lives had changed significantly over the past few months. With a newborn at home, neither of them were really able to go out as much, especially Nikki, who was still breastfeeding. So when her friend offered to look after baby Dylan for her and Doug on a Friday evening, the same weekend that Michaela and Tyler were already going to be with their dad, Nikki immediately said yes. She was glad to have the opportunity to let loose a bit and just be in the company of other adults. That night would start off exactly as Nikki had hoped. The photo you're seeing on screen right now was actually taken at the concert she and Doug went to. And as you can see, they're both smiling and having a great time. Unfortunately, though, shortly after this image was captured, something would happen that would set in motion a chain of disastrous events. And sadly, this would end up being one of the last photos ever taken of Nicole Vanderheyden. Oh, hey there. It's Nigel from the future. I'm just sitting here at the Crime Zone desk working on next week's story. You see, the video you're watching now is actually the one I did last week, so this is the one we're doing next week. Well, I guess technically you won't see that until the week after from my perspective. Confused? Yeah, me too. These are the kinds of things you think about when you spend too much time alone in one room. I should probably get outside more. You know what else would make this whole process a lot easier, though? If I could write for more than 20 uninterrupted minutes without receiving some kind of ridiculous robocall. You know the ones I'm talking about, where you pick up and for some reason an AI woman is trying to scam you out of thousands of dollars while speaking in Mandarin. It's annoying, but it also brings up an excellent question. How are these people getting our phone numbers in the first place? Well, the answer is pretty disturbing. It turns out that there are these companies called data brokers. They get rich by collecting and selling your and my data. And let's just say they're not exactly picky about who their clients are. Sure, some are just irritating, like random marketers, but others are just straight up criminals. And with our increasingly digital world, it's not just your phone number you have to worry about. Have you tried Googling yourself lately? You might be surprised how much of your personal information is just freely available online. Now, there's some good news and bad news here. The good news is that legally these companies have to remove your information if you ask them to. The bad news is that they make that as hard as possible for you to do. Luckily, that's where the sponsor of today's video, Aura, comes in. They automatically identify and reach out to these data brokers on your behalf and make sure your personal information stays private. As you might remember, we've talked about Aura in the past, but they've made some major updates to their services since we last told you about them. Now, not only do they protect you from data brokers, they offer things like real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and a bunch more. The idea is that Aura provides an all-in-one privacy and security solution. It's like having your very own digital security team. If you're interested, Aura is currently offering 14 days free to Crime Zone viewers, so you can try it out for yourself. To get started and see Aura in action, head over to aura.com/crimezone, or simply click the link in the description below. That's aura.com/crimezone to start taking back control of your digital privacy today. The following afternoon, so May 21st, 2016, a couple of teenage boys named Tommy and Jacob were in the middle of doing some farm work in the village of Bellevue, Wisconsin. Bellevue is also located just outside of Green Bay, and the boys were helping Tommy's grandfather Richard prepare his fields so that he could grow some alfalfa. For most of that day, the teens had been focused mainly on the fields themselves, clearing out rocks and other debris so that they would be ready for planting. But shortly before 2 p.m. that afternoon, for some reason, they found themselves over near one of the edges of the property that ran along Hoffman Road. It was here that they spotted something in the tall grass and bushes that separated the fields from the roadway. At first, they thought it might be a deer or some kind of other large wild animal. But When they took a closer look, to their horror, they realized that that was not the case. And as soon as they saw what this actually was, they ran to get Tommy's grandfather, who called 911.
Brown County 911, what is the address of your emergency?
We just found a human body laying in some weeds.
Okay, person beyond help, or do I need to give you instructions for CPR?
No, it's beyond help. It's starting to decay.
Is it a male or a female?
It's got long hair, but I didn't go near it.
It turned out that the boys had discovered the body of a woman. It looked like she had been dumped in the field where she was found. And when investigators from the Brown County Sheriff's Department arrived, they were immediately struck by the brutality of the scene. The woman was lying face down with her arms and hands up around her head. Her feet were pointing towards the road, and with the exception of a pair of socks and a pink disposable bracelet, she was completely nude. It was clear, based on the woman's injuries, that she'd been the victim of a vicious attack, one in which she'd fought hard for her life. Her fingernails were damaged, there was blood on her face and in her hair, bruises and abrasions covered her body, and there were thin, cord-like marks on her neck. An autopsy would soon reveal the full extent of the savage killing. The woman had more than 240 different wounds across her body, including zigzag-patterned shoe marks on her back that showed she'd been repeatedly stomped on. Additional injuries indicated that she had been sexually assaulted. And though no murder weapon was found near her body, her cause of death was ruled to be a combination of blunt force trauma and ligature strangulation. Now, for obvious reasons, this was a lot to take in, but before authorities could even really begin to ask themselves what had happened here, they received another phone call. This one was from Doug Detrie. He said that his girlfriend, Nikki Vanderheyden, was missing. And as he began to give more details about her and the previous night, detectives were almost positive that they had just identified their victim. Not only was Doug's physical description of Nikki an exact match, but when he gave his address, they realized it was less than 3 miles away from the field where they were currently standing. A female officer was immediately sent out to Doug's home, but despite the suspicion that detectives had found Nikki's body, she didn't yet share this with him. Instead, the officer was there to ask questions and collect as much information as possible, starting with what Nikki had been doing in the lead up to her murder. Doug stated that the previous night, he and Nikki had gone to a local bar in Green Bay with some friends called the Watering Hole to see a concert put on by the band Steel Panther. He said they'd had a great time at the actual show. However, afterwards, things had kind of taken a turn. Doug explained that there was a pretty decent-sized group of them that were hanging out together that night. And when the concert ended between 11 and 11:30, there had been some confusion about what the plan was next. Some of the group started heading to another bar called the Sardine Can right away, but he and his friend Greg stayed behind to have a couple more drinks at the Watering Hole. Nikki had ended up going with the rest of the group, and as a result, they'd been separated. Doug said that this was purely an accident, and that when he and Greg learned what had happened, they planned to catch up with everyone in a bit. But pretty soon, he started getting angry texts from Nikki. Well, actually, angry doesn't quite capture the energy here. Nikki was pissed. In the messages, she accused Doug multiple times of cheating, suggesting that he had deliberately stayed behind to chat up other women. She called him an abusive asshole and said that this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this to her. When the officer saw these texts, she had quite a few questions. But what caught her attention more than anything was Doug's response. He said that at the time, he didn't take Nikki's messages all that seriously because he knew that she'd had a lot to drink. He also framed things in a way where he made it seem like he had no idea why Nikki was upset with him.
Why is she calling you abusive?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know where she gets this stuff sometimes.
Is that common for her to talk that way to you when she's been drinking?
Sometimes, yeah, I mean...
Or when she's sober?
She doesn't drink that often, but...
Okay.
All of a sudden she gets that in her head that that's what's going on.
Sure.
Doug went on to say that he and Greg left the Watering Hole a little while later, but by the time they arrived at the Sardine Can, Nikki wasn't there. And when he spoke to some of his friends, he learned that she had stormed out of the bar on her own and left after becoming more and more angry about how long it was taking him to get there. One member of the group had actually gone out and tried to stop Nikki from walking off because of how late it was and how much she'd had to drink. But according to this friend, she had freaked out and said that she wanted to be left alone. Doug stated that he and Greg drove around looking for Nikki and that he called her multiple times. Though they were able to talk on the phone briefly, he said that she was slurring her words and refused to go back to the bar and meet them. Doug told the officer that after quite a bit more unsuccessful searching, he decided to call it a night. When he was dropped off by Greg at his house, the babysitter was still there, and there was no sign of Nikki, but he assumed she was probably on her way there. With that, he checked on the baby and went to bed, falling asleep sometime between 2:30 and 3 a.m. Though this is more or less where the initial conversation with Doug ended, only a few hours passed before police showed up at the house again. You see, when the female officer passed along what she had learned, detectives did not find Doug's story very convincing. They were particularly troubled by those text messages Nikki had sent to him right before she left the sardine can, as well as Doug's seemingly unserious response to the whole thing. They asked him to come down to the station for further questioning, to which he agreed. One of the first things investigators wanted to know was why Doug had waited until late into the afternoon to contact them about Nikki's disappearance. Yes, sure, maybe he believed she was still on her way home when he went to bed after getting home from the bar. But what about when he woke up the next morning? What had he been doing all that time? Doug said mostly he'd been at the house recovering from his hangover and tending to his newborn son. Moreover, he said the reason he hadn't immediately called police was because this wasn't the first time Nikki had walked off after they got into an argument while drinking. Nothing bad had ever happened before, so he assumed there was nothing to worry about this time either. He said that he told himself that she was just upset and that she'd probably spent the night at a friend's place. It wasn't until he started contacting some of the people close to her and he realized that none of them had heard from her either that he really started to get worried. At this point, investigators decided to tell Doug more about what they knew. By now, the fact that a body had been recovered from a field in Bellevue had been reported on the 10 o'clock news, so it was only a matter of time before the information started reaching him and other members of Nikki's family. The detectives told him that they strongly suspected that these were Nikki's remains.
This news thing is freaking me out. Can you tell me it's not her?
Well, I think what we're looking at is this body that was found, okay, down the street. I don't think it's been 100% identified as her, but there's a lot of similarities.
I'm going to talk to everybody on that freaking street in that neighborhood. I need to do it. I swear to God, I'm going to find who did this.
Doug appeared genuinely heartbroken and emotional at the revelation, and he said that he would do whatever he could to cooperate and make sure that the person responsible was found. But that was the thing. The more detectives had spoken to Doug, the more they felt like the person they were looking for might already be sitting in front of them. And that feeling was only about to grow, especially as new evidence began to emerge that seemed to contradict a lot of what he had told them. If there were any remaining doubts that the victim recovered from the field in Bellevue really was Nikki Vanderheyden, those went away the following morning when another chilling discovery was made. On a section of Interstate 172, about half a mile from the body, bloody clothing and other items were found at the side of the road close to an on-ramp. Not only did this clothing match the description of the outfit Nikki was wearing on the night of May 20th, but her cell phone and a lanyard were among the other items that were there. Attached to the lanyard was Nikki's Green Bay School District photo ID. Investigators theorized that after dumping Nikki's body, her killer had discarded her belongings out the window while driving down the highway. As all of this was bagged up and sent off for testing, detectives were busy searching for clues in two other locations. The first was the area near the sardine can where Nikki had last been seen alive. The second was at Doug Detrie's house. In terms of the sardine can, police were hoping that by collecting surveillance video in and around the vicinity of the bar, they would be able to piece together Nikki's movements prior to her murder. This started out very promising. When they reviewed the footage inside the bar from the night of May 20th, they easily found Nikki. They could see how it initially looked like she was having a good time drinking, socializing, and dancing before she eventually left her group and stormed out. Unfortunately, finding video from here proved to be a lot more challenging. So much so that detectives soon had to abandon the idea of being able to follow Nikki's route after leaving the sardine can. However, this wasn't a complete waste of time, because as authorities continued watching the footage from inside the bar, they ended up finding something else. Remember how Doug had said that he and Greg had driven around for all that time looking for Nikki after they found out she wasn't at the sardine can? Well, it turned out the truth was quite a bit more complicated. While the two of them definitely had searched for Nikki for a little bit, afterwards they went right back to the bar and kept drinking like nothing had happened. Surveillance video revealed that it was only a couple hours after that Doug finally went home. To detectives, these did not look like the actions of a man that was concerned about finding his girlfriend. And they began to doubt Doug's version of events even more when they started talking to some of his friends that had been there that night, especially regarding Doug's claims that he had no idea why Nikki was sending those angry texts. A couple of the friends said that it was pretty clear that Doug was ignoring Nikki, and she was upset because the whole reason she went out that night was she wanted to spend time with him. She didn't even know most of the people they were hanging out with all that well. Really, they were Doug's friends. It turned out the final breaking point for Nikki had been when another member of the group named Angela had offered to call Doug for her. When she got through immediately after Nikki kept getting his voicemail, Nikki felt that this was confirmation that Doug was screening her calls. That's when she had stormed off and left the bar. On top of this, according to Doug's own friends, he knew why Nikki was sending him those messages. And this idea that he'd been kind of confused but ultimately understanding because she'd had a lot to drink, it wasn't really true. At least one friend had also heard Doug arguing with Nikki over the phone before she went missing and getting pretty heated with her. So it was clear Nikki's anger and those text messages she had sent, they hadn't just come out of nowhere. Speaking of the text messages, police would later learn that Nikki was not the first one of Doug's girlfriends to accuse him of abusive behavior. One ex who spoke with investigators referred to him as controlling and a stalker type. Another had actually filed a police report against him. The report ultimately didn't go anywhere, but in the incident, the woman claimed Doug had choked her and covered her nose and mouth with blankets during an argument. So yeah, at this point, investigators were seeing a lot of red flags. Doug and Nikki go out together, they're overheard fighting, Nikki sends him those nasty texts, and then several hours later, she turns up dead. It didn't feel to detectives like a coincidence. And their suspicions would only become greater when they searched that second location I told you about, Doug's house. Now, at first glance, the house didn't appear to be all that interesting. There were no signs of a struggle inside, and everything appeared to be in order. But as forensic technicians took a closer look, they began to find a bunch of little things that they felt told a disturbing story. It started in the garage, where investigators found what looked like faint bloodstains. Actually, these weren't just stains, they were smears, ones that suggested something had been dragged across the floor. And not only did these drag marks seem to lead to the area where Nikki's car was parked, a search inside the vehicle turned up additional traces of blood. Back inside the house, more blood was found in one of the bathrooms. Again, this wasn't a huge amount or anything, but it was enough to catch the attention of detectives. There was some on a couple of tissues, some on a sweater, and a few drops that appeared to be leading to a shower. The final thing that authorities recovered inside the residence was a pair of men's shoes belonging to Doug. The shoes had zigzag patterns on the soles that they thought closely resembled those marks they had found on Nikki's body. On top of this, the shoes had little red flecks on them that investigators thought might also be blood. As bad as all of this already looked, though, it was nothing compared to what police found outside of the house. You see, as they were conducting this search, they were alerted by one of Doug's neighbors directly across the street, who said that he had found something that they might want to take a look at. It turned out that while the neighbor had been mowing his lawn, he'd noticed what he realized were large bloodstains on the curb and the side of the road. Nearby, there was a length of thin wire, one that looked like it could have come from the charging cable of a phone. When detectives saw this, They were convinced that they had found their primary crime scene and their murder weapon, both of which were less than 120 feet from Doug Detrie's front door. Though all of this evidence still needed to be sent off for analysis, from the perspective of police, the case against Doug was now overwhelming. As a result, he was arrested on May 23rd, 2 days after Nikki's body was found.
Right now I'm going to be taking you into custody. I'll be handcuffing you. I'll explain all that to you in a bit, and transporting you down to the sheriff's department. Okay?
Okay.
Just be cooperative with me,
all right,
and we'll roll it that way.
Wow, okay.
All right. I'm going to get you down there, and we'll talk down there, and I'll kind of explain to you what's going on. I'm a decent guy.
Okay, I'm a decent guy too.
I get that. I'm sure you are.
For detectives, it seemed like the only thing left to do now was to work on filling in any remaining missing details in the case. However, things would not be this straightforward. In fact, Brown County investigators were about to be dealt one of the most unexpected twists of their entire careers. Following the arrest, detectives came up with a theory about what had happened on the night of Nikki Vanderheyden's murder. They believed that after arriving home from the bar first on the morning of May 21st, Doug had gone into the house and told the babysitter she could go home. When Nikki arrived a short time later, he confronted her outside, and the pair continued their argument from before. Things escalated, Doug had snapped, and he beat and strangled Nikki to death as she tried to run away. Investigators further speculated that after the killing, Doug had dragged Nikki's body back into their garage, where he loaded her into her own vehicle because he had left his at the bar. He then drove to the field about 3 miles away, where he dumped her before discarding her clothes and other personal items along the highway. After returning home, he cleaned everything up, including himself, hence the traces of blood in the garage, the vehicle, and the bathroom. As for the motive behind the crime, there was obviously all of the fighting that had been going on between Doug and Nikki. But investigators also thought that there might be something else. While digging deeper into Doug's text messages, they came across an exchange between him and his mother from just a couple of weeks before the murder. During that conversation, Doug explained that the pressure of being a family man was getting to him. Within the span of a little over a year, he'd gone from being a bachelor to having a serious relationship and living with 3 kids. He said he felt trapped and he wanted out. He wrote to his mom in part, quote, "I'm very seriously thinking about telling Nikki and the kids they have to move. I'm not cut out for this life one bit. When this house sells, we're going separate ways for sure. Don't worry about it. It is what it is." Reading these messages, detectives wondered if Doug's unhappiness with his new life had finally boiled over. Maybe he somehow irrationally felt that killing Nikki was the only way out. So yeah, police had a theory of the case and a potential motive. By now, it was a couple of weeks since Doug had been taken into custody, and the district attorney's office was getting ready to officially file charges against him for Nikki's murder. But that's when something pretty wild happened. The tests on the evidence collected both inside and outside of Doug's house started to come back. And let's just say the results were not what anyone expected. Let's start with the traces of blood in Nikki's car. Well, those belonged to her daughter and were from a completely unrelated non-criminal incident. It was the same story with the blood in the bathroom. The drops found near the shower, on that sweater, and on those tissues was from Nikki's sister Heather, who'd had a nosebleed there a little while before. As for the stains and drag marks in the garage, that was blood too, but it wasn't human. It was animal blood. As it turned out, Doug was into hunting, and he'd gone on a trip for turkey season a few weeks earlier. The shoes turned out not to have blood on them at all, and when lab techs tried to compare the soles to Nikki's injuries, they were too generic to say with any degree of confidence whether they were a match. That being said, the evidence from outside the house very much was part of the case. The blood on the curb was determined to be Nikki's, and the thin cord recovered nearby had her DNA on it, as well as a partial male profile. However, this profile did not belong to Doug Detrie. To say that this was a shock would be a massive understatement. Out of nowhere, the case against Doug Detrie had completely collapsed. And so 18 days after he was first arrested, he was released from the county jail. As frustrating and baffling as this was for investigators, though, The analysis of the evidence did prove that they were right about one thing. Nikki had made it almost all the way home on the morning of her murder. Disturbingly, she'd been killed within view of her own front door. For detectives, the next step was obvious. In order to find out what had happened to Nikki and who had killed her, they needed to find out how she had gotten home. This would be easier said than done. But fortunately for police, luck was on their side. Over the next several weeks, not much progress was made in the investigation. Yes, authorities now knew more or less where to focus, but the only evidence they really had was incomplete. That unknown male DNA they had pulled from the cord used to strangle Nikki was only enough to create a partial profile. So while it had been adequate to rule out Doug, it wasn't enough to put into search databases like CODIS. However, that changed sometime in August, so about 3 months after the murder. That's when Brown County investigators received another call from the forensics lab. This time, they had way better news. Not only had they managed to pull a much more substantial amount of DNA from one of the socks Nikki was wearing when she was found, this complete profile matched up with the partial one from the murder weapon. And when this DNA was put into CODIS, it returned a hit. The match was to a man named George Stephen Birch. Now, George Birch was a name investigators had never heard before. He was 38 years old and was originally from Virginia. However, as police started looking more into his background, what they found was pretty interesting. For starters, George Birch had a pretty substantial criminal record. Most of his convictions were for crimes like burglary and theft, but as detectives soon learned, this wasn't the first time his name had come up in a murder investigation. Back in 1998, he'd been put on trial for the fatal shooting of a man named Joey White. He had been acquitted in that case, but still, it was a detail that couldn't be ignored. What also couldn't be ignored was George's more recent history. Just a few months ago, he'd moved to Wisconsin and had been staying with an old friend and his wife, Ed and Linda Jackson. And Ed and Linda's place was only a mile from that strip of bars in Green Bay where Nikki had last been seen before she was killed. There was something else that police found when they looked up George's name, though. And this would turn out to be the most consequential thing of all. So, shortly after Nikki's murder, Green Bay police had investigated an unusual situation involving a Chevy Blazer SUV. The vehicle had been part of a hit-and-run crash and was later found abandoned and partially fire-damaged. The SUV belonged to Ed Jackson, but he had loaned it to George to use while he was staying with him. When George was questioned about this at the time, he claimed the vehicle had been stolen from him and he was not the one driving when the crash occurred. This investigation ultimately hadn't led anywhere and was closed. But during his interviews with police, George Birch had agreed to provide them with a download of the contents of his phone. Part of that included his Google dashboard information, which had with it all of the geolocation data from the device as well. And when Brown County detectives got a hold of this information and started going through it, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. George's GPS data was linked to every single location of interest in the Nikki Vanderheyden case. It was like a roadmap of the crime. The data showed that on the night of May 20th, George had been at a bar called Richard Cranium's, which is only about half a mile from the sardine can. When he left at around 2:30 the following morning, he had briefly gone back to Ed and Linda's place, but then he had driven directly to Doug and Nikki's house. He had been outside there for between 40 and 50 minutes before heading to his next destination, that field in Bellevue where Nikki's body had been dumped. The GPS data was precise enough that it even corresponded with the exact area of the field where Nikki was found. George then drove down the section of Interstate 172 where Nikki's clothes and personal items were recovered, finally returning back to Ed and Linda's place shortly before 4:30 a.m. If all of this wasn't damning enough, George's internet search history revealed that he had been obsessively keeping tabs on Nikki's case. Following the murder, he'd looked up dozens of local news articles written about the story, and had been continuously following the developments. With the DNA, the map data, and this other circumstantial evidence, detectives came up with a new theory. On the morning of May 21st, George Birch had spotted Nikki either at another bar after she left the sardine can, or while she was walking down the street alone. He'd offered her a ride, and she'd accepted, not realizing that George wasn't simply trying to be a good Samaritan. When he made sexual advances towards her and she wasn't into it, he forced himself on her before brutally beating, stomping, and strangling her to death. While putting all of this together, Brown County investigators kept George under surveillance. When they finally felt like they were ready, they moved in and placed him under arrest on September 7th, 2016. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with Nikki's murder. At this point, authorities were feeling pretty confident, but they had learned from before with Doug Detrie that just because their case looked like a slam dunk, it didn't necessarily mean that they were in the clear. So now they were very careful to make sure they had done their due diligence. This would turn out to be incredibly important, because as I hinted at the beginning of this video, there was one final twist waiting for prosecutors at trial. Only this time, authorities would be ready with a bombshell of their own. By the time the trial began, it was February of 2018, so nearly 2 years after Nikki Vanderheyden's murder. And as you might imagine, this whole thing had been an awful roller coaster of a ride for her loved ones. In addition to dealing with the grief and horror of the actual loss, they had also had to endure the whiplash of going from thinking that Doug was responsible to learning that this was actually a totally random killing. But things were about to get even more difficult. You see, that whole initial confusion with Doug and his arrest, George Birch and his defense team would capitalize on this in a major way, to the point that while George was technically the one on trial, the proceedings would become a sort of trial by proxy of Doug Detrie as well. It began when George Birch took the stand and he gave his version of what he said had really happened on the night of the murder. George stated that on the morning of May 21st, he had run into Nikki at a bar after she left the sardine can. The two of them got to talking, things were flirty, and he ended up asking her if she wanted to get out of there. She agreed, and they left in George's Chevy Blazer. George claimed that initially they were planning to go back to his place, but when they got there, one of the lights was on, meaning that either Ed or Linda was still up. So Nikki suggested that they go to her house instead. They did so immediately after, but when they arrived, she remembered that the babysitter was there. As a workaround, the two of them decided simply to fool around in the back of George's SUV. He said that Nikki removed her clothes, they began getting intimate, and then everything had gone sideways. George stated that out of nowhere, he'd been hit hard in the back of the head and was knocked unconscious. The next thing he knew, he was waking up on the ground, and there was a man standing over him with a gun. At the time, he said he'd never seen this man before, but now he recognized him as Doug Detrie. As he looked over by the other side of his SUV, he could see Nikki lying unresponsive at the side of the road, covered in blood. After catching the two of them messing around, Doug had murdered Nikki in a jealous rage. George explained that while still holding him at gunpoint, Doug forced him to put Nikki's body in the back of the Chevy Blazer. He then instructed him to drive to the field where they dumped her remains. George said Doug was careful to make him do all of the disposal to make sure only his DNA was on all of the incriminating evidence. He claimed he had no choice but to do what Doug wanted, but that at the first chance he got, he seized his opportunity to escape. When Doug was momentarily distracted, he lunged at him and pushed him to the ground before sprinting back to his vehicle. He then drove off, throwing Nikki's clothes and other belongings out of the window in a panic as he headed home. As for why George had never contacted police about the murder, he said that he was traumatized by what had happened, and he was afraid that he would get in trouble. At the time, he was on parole, and he wasn't supposed to leave the state of Virginia, so he felt his best option was to simply keep quiet. Now, right off the bat, there were problems with George's story. Aside from sounding quite fantastical, the idea that Nikki would have been looking for any kind of sexual encounter with a stranger while she was still breastfeeding seemed far-fetched to those that knew her, especially the way that George had described it. It's important to point out here that George Birch is 6 feet 7 inches tall. So when he said that Nikki and him were fooling around in the back of his SUV, what he actually meant was that she was lying down on the seats in the back and he was standing fully outside, right across the street from her house at 3 o'clock in the morning. George's size also played a factor when it came to his claims that Doug had attacked him. Yes, George said that Doug was armed at the time, but the whole pistol whipping him into unconsciousness thing seemed a lot harder to believe when you factored in the considerable height disparity between them. Most damning of all, though, was George's explanation regarding the DNA evidence. While his story might explain why his DNA was found on Nikki's body, it did not explain why only his DNA was found on the murder weapon. Even so, remember, things didn't exactly look great for Doug. All of the physical evidence that authorities found in the house might not have panned out, but there was still more than enough to work with for George and his defense lawyers to try and make Doug look guilty. They leaned into his seeming lack of concern for Nikki's safety, those texts where she'd accused him of being abusive, and the amount of time that passed between him getting home from the bar and when he contacted police to report her missing. I should mention that in between the murder and the trial, Doug had also managed to get himself in trouble with the law once again. About 9 months after Nikki's death, Doug was arrested for a false imprisonment case involving her sister, Heather. After Nikki was killed, Heather had temporarily moved in with Doug to help him look after Dylan. But one day in February of 2017, while they were in the car together, Doug had made sexual advances towards her. When Heather asked him to stop, Doug apparently flipped out and refused to let her out of the vehicle. He then began speeding down the road, at one point blowing through a red light. According to a criminal complaint, he only stopped after Heather started kicking the car's windshield. Doug ended up pleading no contest to several offenses related to the incident. While this particular incident was not allowed into the trial as evidence, I bring it up to hammer home the point that Doug hadn't done himself any favors here. And remember, the whole idea for George and his defense team was to create reasonable doubt. This strategy worked pretty well. That was, until prosecutors introduced a twist of their own. You see, they had a secret witness. That witness was Doug's Fitbit, the same one that I told you about that Nikki had bought for him as a gift. In a heartbreaking and poignant twist, this gift would prove once and for all that Doug Detrie was innocent. Both the Fitbit's sleep and step data showed that just like Doug had told police from the beginning, he was in bed at the time Nikki was murdered. Between 3 a.m. and 6:30 when he had woken up, he had taken between 12 and 18 steps. Basically, he'd walked far enough to check on his newborn son, and nothing more. When the trial was over, George Birch was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide after just 4 hours of jury deliberation. 3 months later, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While George continues to maintain his innocence to this day and deny responsibility for Nikki's murder, his conviction has been upheld by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. At the time of this recording, he remains incarcerated at the Fox Lake Correctional Institution. I'll keep this short because I've already gone on long enough here, but I just wanted to say briefly that for me, this case was definitely a reminder about the importance of following the evidence. There are a lot of things that can make someone look guilty, but it's quite another thing to prove it. I gotta say, even though I don't think Doug Detrie will be winning any World's Best Boyfriend awards, I came away from this one feeling pretty bad for him. Not only did he also lose someone close to him, but suspicion was cast on him long after it was clear that he was innocent. Now, obviously, there's still a long list of other people I feel worse for, especially Nikki's children, but I think it bears repeating here. Being a jerk does not make you a murderer. And in terms of his actions afterwards, if I'm being charitable to Doug here, I just say that grief can make you do some really stupid things. Speaking of Nikki's children, based on the latest available information we could find, Michaela and Tyler went to live with their father. Dylan, meanwhile, remained with Doug and continues to be raised by him and his family. Before we wrap up, we just wanted to give a huge shout out to everyone who made it this far into the video. As always, we hope you found today's story interesting and informative. A huge thanks as well to today's sponsor, Aura. Don't forget to check out the link in the description below to get your 2-week free trial. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. Once again, thanks so much, everyone, and take care.